The radio crackled with static before Colonel Marcus Webb's voice cut through the operations center like a blade through silk. Phantom 6-1 is off the grid. No comms for 17 minutes. His weathered face reflected the blue glow of multiple screens, each tracking convoys scattered across the Afghan desert like breadcrumbs in a fairy tale gone wrong. But this wasn't a story with happy endings. Staff Sergeant Riley Torres leaned closer to her console, fingers dancing across frequencies she knew by heart. The convoy carrying medical supplies to Forward Operating Base Calmer had vanished somewhere in the Helmand province, swallowed by terrain that had been claiming soldiers for decades. 23 souls aboard those Humvees, including a trauma surgeon whose hands had saved more lives than anyone kept count of. Last known position, Torres asked, though she already knew the answer would taste like sand and fear. Grid 41, RNP 7845923. Webb's response came flat, professional, but Torres caught the tremor underneath. She'd worked with him long enough to recognize when the old man was rattled. Intel suggests possible insurgent activity in Sector 7. Could be an ambush. The word hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Ambush. In this business, it meant good people dying in bad places, usually while trying to help someone else. Torres had seen the aftermath too many times, twisted metal cooling under an indifferent sun, personal effects scattered like confetti from a celebration nobody wanted to attend. "Sir, we have assets in the area." She pulled up the tactical display, watching friendly blue icons crawl across the digital landscape. Warthog flight, call sign Reaper 27, approximately 8 minutes out from target area. Webb's eyes narrowed. Everyone in the TOC knew about Reaper 27. Captain Zara Phoenix Akaffer, the A-10 pilot who'd somehow earned her wings despite every institutional barrier the Air Force could manufacture. Some called her lucky. Others whispered different words when they thought nobody was listening. But Torres had heard the combat recordings, had seen the gun camera footage that made hardened infantry sergeants go quiet. "Negative," Webb said, shaking his head. "Phoenix is complicated. We need someone reliable for this." Outside, the desert wind howled against reinforced windows, carrying the scent of dust and diesel fuel that marked every forward base in this forgotten corner of the world. Somewhere in that wasteland, 23 Americans were either fighting for their lives or already beyond help. And the only asset close enough to matter was a pilot whose reputation had been built on equal parts skill and controversy, flying a plane that looked like it belonged in a museum rather than a modern battlefield. Torres watched the blue icon representing Reaper 27 circle in the empty sky, waiting for orders that might never come. Time was bleeding away like water in the sand, and she wondered if pride would cost more lives today than the enemy ever could. The radio stayed silent, but silence in war usually meant someone was already dying. Webb's hand hovered over the communication switch, and Torres could almost hear him thinking, calculating the risk of trusting Phoenix against the certainty of losing Phantom 6-1. The digital clock on the main display counted seconds like a funeral dirge, each number bringing them closer to the moment when rescue became recovery. "Sir," Torres said softly, knowing she was crossing lines that junior NCOs weren't supposed to cross. "Sometimes complicated gets the job done." Through the reinforced glass, she could see the sun setting behind distant mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and regret. Somewhere beneath that same sky, Phoenix Akaffer was waiting in her armored cockpit, engines humming with barely contained violence, ready to bring down thunder on anyone stupid enough to threaten American lives. But first, someone had to give her permission to fly into hell. The operations center hummed with the electric tension of decisions unmade and time running out. Captain Zara Phoenix Akaffer had been circling grid coordinates for 6 minutes when her radio finally crackled to life with a voice she'd heard before, always skeptical, always careful, always treating her like a problem to be managed rather than a weapon to be unleashed. "Reaper 27, this is Overlord. We have a possible situation developing in Sector 7. Stand by for further instructions." Phoenix adjusted her helmet, feeling the familiar weight of the aircraft around her like a second skin. The A-10 Thunderbolt II wasn't pretty. It looked like someone had built an airplane around the ugliest gun ever manufactured, then decided ugly was exactly what they needed. 7 barrels of 30mm hatred, capable of spitting depleted uranium rounds at a rate that turned armored vehicles into abstract art. Overlord Reaper 27, standing by. Her voice carried the clipped professionalism that had taken years to perfect, hiding the frustration that came with being the last option instead of the first choice. Current fuel state allows for 43-minute station time. Below, the Afghan landscape rolled past like a geological lesson in violence, ancient valleys carved by water and wind, now scarred by roadside bombs and rocket strikes. She'd flown this route dozens of times, memorizing every ridge and wadi where enemies might hide, every clearing where friendlies might need cover. The terrain held secrets like a miser hoarding gold, and today those secrets might be deadly. Her targeting pod swept the ground methodically, thermal imaging painting the world in white-hot signatures against cool purple shadows. Nothing moved except dust devils spinning across empty ground, but Phoenix had learned to read the landscape like others read faces. The wrong kind of stillness often meant trouble brewing just beyond the next hill. Reaper 27, Overlord. We have lost contact with friendly convoy, call sign Phantom 61. Last known position Grid 41, RNP 7845923. Request immediate reconnaissance and possible close air support if situation develops. Phoenix's pulse quickened. Close air support, the 3 words that transformed her from just another pilot into something altogether more dangerous. Her hands found the familiar controls without conscious thought, muscle memory, guiding her through pre-combat checks that had been drilled into her bones through hundreds of training flights and dozens of combat missions. Overlord, Reaper 27 copies. Proceeding to Grid 41, RNP 7845923 for reconnaissance. She banked the aircraft eastward, feeling the slight protest of wings loaded with Maverick missiles and high-explosive rockets. Request any additional intelligence on enemy activity in the area. Negative intel at this time, Reaper. Proceed with caution and report any contact. The radio went silent, leaving Phoenix alone with the sound of twin turbofan engines and her own controlled breathing. 43 minutes to find a lost convoy in terrain that had been swallowing armies since Alexander the Great decided Afghanistan looked like a good idea. She'd faced worse odds, but never with stakes this high. Through her heads-up display, she could see the target grid coordinates approaching, marked by nothing more than empty desert and the shadows of late afternoon. But Phoenix had learned to trust her instincts more than her instruments, and right now every instinct she possessed was screaming that she was about to fly into something much worse than a simple search and rescue. The mountains ahead held their secrets close, but she was about to make them give up their dead, one way or another. Phoenix dropped to 3,000 feet, low enough to distinguish tire tracks from animal trails, high enough to avoid small arms fire from anyone stupid enough to take potshots at an A-10. The landscape below transformed from abstract patterns into concrete details, abandoned compounds with walls pockmarked by decades of conflict, irrigation ditches that might hide anything from farmers to insurgents, rocky outcroppings that provided perfect cover for ambush positions. Her radio crackled with distant chatter from other aircraft, but nothing about Phantom 61. Radio silence from a convoy usually meant one of 3 things: equipment failure, tactical necessity, or they were all dead. Phoenix had been flying long enough to develop a sixth sense about which possibility she was dealing with, and today that sense was telling her to prepare for the worst. Overlord Reaper 27, approaching target grid now, beginning systematic search pattern. She banked into a lazy figure 8, using her targeting pod to sweep the terrain methodically. The thermal imaging revealed the ghostly signatures of animals moving through distant valleys, but no human activity, no vehicles, no heat signatures that might indicate a convoy in distress. Just empty landscape baking under the Afghan sun, keeping its secrets buried beneath layers of dust and time. Reaper 27, Overlord. Any visual contact with Phantom 61. Negative, Overlord. No visual or thermal contacts at this time. Expanding search pattern to adjacent grids. Phoenix widened her orbit, fighting the growing sense that she was looking in the wrong place for the wrong thing. Convoys didn't just vanish without trace. There should be wreckage, bodies, some indication of what had happened to 23 American service members and their vehicles. The absence of evidence was becoming evidence of something else entirely. That's when she saw it, a glint of sunlight off metal in a wadi approximately 2 kilometers north of the last known position. She rolled inverted and pulled through a diving turn that would have made her flight instructor proud, dropping altitude while maintaining visual contact with whatever had reflected that brief flash of light. Overlord Reaper 27. Possible contact bearing 045 degrees from original search grid. Investigating. The wadi cut through the landscape like a surgical incision, its bottom lost in shadows that could hide a dozen vehicles. Phoenix activated her targeting laser and began painting potential targets, watching thermal blooms resolve into recognizable shapes. Humvees. 5 of them, arranged in what looked like a defensive circle. But something was wrong with the picture: no movement, no heat signatures from engines or personnel. Overlord, I have visual on 5 vehicles in defensive position, approximately 2 clicks north of original grid. No signs of life. Appears to be Phantom 61. The radio stayed silent for long seconds before Colonel Webb's voice came back, heavy with the weight of command decisions. Reaper 27, proceed with low pass for detailed reconnaissance. Report any signs of personnel, friendly or hostile. Phoenix pushed the throttles forward and dove toward the wadi, her aircraft's shadow racing across the ground below like a dark omen. At 500 feet, details became visible that thermal imaging couldn't provide. Bullet holes in armored panels, scorch marks from explosions, and bodies, American bodies, scattered around the vehicles like broken dolls. But there was something else, something that made her blood run cold. Movement in the rocks above the wadi, muzzle flashes winking like deadly fireflies. The ambush was still active, and the bastards were using her countrymen as bait. Phoenix had found Phantom 61. Now she had to decide whether she was conducting a rescue or planning a funeral. The muzzle flashes told the story that Phoenix's eyes had been dreading to read. This wasn't a recovery operation, it was still a firefight. Phantom 61 had been caught in a carefully planned ambush, and whoever had sprung the trap was still in position, waiting for rescue assets to arrive. Like her. Overlord Reaper 27. I have multiple hostile positions in the rocks overlooking Phantom 61's location. The ambush is still active. Request immediate CASEVAC and ground support. She pulled into a climbing turn, keeping the target area in sight while gaining altitude and distance from the killing field below. Her aircraft might be armored, but concentrated small arms fire could still bring down even an A-10 if the shooters got lucky. And right now, luck seemed to be running in favor of the wrong side. Reaper 27, Overlord, can you confirm friendly casualties? Phoenix leveled off at 8,000 feet and brought her targeting pod to bear on the vehicles again. The thermal imaging revealed the heat signatures of multiple bodies, but distinguishing between wounded and dead from this altitude required a kind of brutal calculus she'd learned to perform without flinching. Overlord, I count at least 6 heat signatures among the vehicles. Movement appears minimal but present. Unknown number of additional personnel may be taking cover. Hostile positions are approximately 50 to 75 meters up the eastern wall of the wadi, elevated firing positions, with excellent cover and concealment. She traced the enemy positions with her laser designator, marking each muzzle flash for future reference. Classical ambush setup, high ground, overlapping fields of fire, multiple escape routes through the rocky terrain. Whoever had planned this knew their business, and they'd chosen their killing ground with professional expertise. Reaper 27, closest ground assets are 37 minutes out. Can you provide immediate close air support to suppress hostile positions? 37 minutes. Phoenix did the math automatically. In 37 minutes, any wounded members of Phantom 6-1 would be beyond help, and the ambushers would have vanished back into the mountains like smoke. This was her moment, the point where training and experience converged into action that would be measured in lives saved or lost. Overlord, Reaper 27. I can provide immediate CAS, but I'll need clearance for danger close engagement. Hostile positions are within 100 meters of friendly forces. Danger close. The phrase that separated pilots who flew by the book from those who wrote their own rules in blood and cordite. It meant accepting the possibility that her weapons might kill the people she was trying to save, trusting her skills and her aircraft's precision to thread the needle between salvation and catastrophe. Reaper 27, Overlord. You are cleared for danger close engagement of hostile positions. Exercise extreme caution for friendly forces. Phoenix felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with combat authorization. Her hands moved across the weapons panel with practiced efficiency, selecting high-explosive rockets for the initial attack. The A-10's GAU-8 cannon would have to wait, too much risk of overpenetration that might reach the trapped Americans below. Overlord Reaper 27 is rolling in hot. Danger close attack, high-explosive ordnance. All friendly forces take cover immediately. She pushed the stick forward and felt the familiar sensation of controlled falling as the aircraft dove toward the rocky hillside where muzzle flashes continued to wink like malevolent stars. Time compressed into the eternal seconds of combat, where every decision carried the weight of lives and every mistake could be measured in blood. Below, Phantom 6-1 waited for salvation or destruction, and Phoenix Akafor was about to deliver one or the other. The world narrowed to the green circle of her heads-up display as Phoenix rolled into her attack run. At this angle, diving toward the eastern wall of the wadi, she could see the enemy positions with crystal clarity muzzle flashes from at least 8 different locations, coordinated fields of fire designed to turn the bottom of the wadi into a killing ground. Professional work by people who understood the deadly mathematics of ambush warfare. Her targeting system locked onto the northernmost position, where she could see the distinctive signature of a heavy machine gun. PKM, most likely, Soviet-era weapon that could chew through armored Humvees like paper if given enough time and ammunition. That gun had to die first. Overlord Reaper 27, tally hostile heavy weapon northern position, engaging with rockets. The rocket left its rail with a sound like ripping canvas, contrail drawing a perfectly straight line between her aircraft and the rocky outcropping, where the machine gun had been chattering death at the Americans below. The explosion bloomed orange and black against gray stone, sending debris cascading down the hillside like a deadly avalanche. Immediately, she pulled into a climbing turn to assess damage and reposition for the next attack. Her ears strained for radio chatter from the ground, any sign that Phantom 6-1 was still capable of communication. Static filled the airwaves, broken by the distant sound of automatic weapons fire continuing from the remaining enemy positions. Reaper 27, Overlord, good effect on target, continue engagement. Phoenix rolled inverted and pulled through another diving attack, this time targeting a cluster of positions on the southern end of the ambush line. The insurgents were firing more frantically now, recognizing that their carefully planned trap was becoming their own killing ground. Muzzle flashes strobed in desperate patterns as they tried to engage both the aircraft above and the Americans below. Her second rocket struck dead center among three fighting positions, the concussion wave visible as it rippled outward from the point of impact. She could see bodies tumbling through the air like rag dolls, the physics of high explosives rendering human flesh into component elements with mathematical precision. Overlord Reaper 27, two positions neutralized, continuing to service remaining targets. But something was changing in the pattern of enemy fire. What had been coordinated defensive positions were becoming scattered, desperate shots, as the surviving ambushers began to realize their situation had shifted from hunters to hunted. She could see movement among the rocks, figures in flowing robes scrambling for new positions or attempting to escape through the mountain passes. Reaper 27 were observing enemy movement attempting to disengage from contact. Can you interdict their escape routes? Phoenix scanned the terrain with her targeting pod, identifying the natural choke points and game trails that led away from the ambush site. These mountains had been home to fighters for thousands of years, and they knew every path and hiding place like their own names. But they'd never faced an A-10 pilot who'd spent 3 years studying this particular piece of Afghanistan. She banked toward the most obvious escape route, a narrow defile between two peaks that offered the only covered approach to the main valley system. If she could close that gap with precision weapons, the surviving ambushers would be trapped against the rocks with nowhere to run. Overlord Reaper 27 is repositioning to block enemy egress, switching to gun for precision engagement. Her finger found the trigger for the A-10 cannon, 30 millimeters of depleted uranium fury capable of turning stone to powder and flesh to mist. But precision was everything now. Too high and she'd miss. Too low and the rounds might ricochet toward Phantom 6-1. The aircraft shuddered as the cannon spoke its deadly vocabulary, 7 barrels spinning death at 65 rounds per second. The sound of the GAU-8 firing was unlike anything else in military aviation, a deep, resonant growl that seemed to emanate from the earth itself rather than an aircraft. Phoenix felt the familiar vibration through her seat as depleted uranium rounds chewed through stone and flesh with equal enthusiasm, each trigger pull unleashing enough kinetic energy to stop a main battle tank. Her targeting display showed the rounds impacting exactly where she'd intended, the narrow defile that represented the ambusher's primary escape route. Stone exploded into razor-sharp fragments, creating an impassable barrier of rubble and devastation that would channel any survivors into her killing field. Overlord Reaper 27, enemy egress route blocked, observing multiple secondary explosions, possibly munition storage. She rolled into another orbit, using her elevated position to conduct battle damage assessment. The rocky hillside that had been alive with muzzle flashes 2 minutes earlier was now silent, shrouded in dust and smoke from her attacks. Her thermal imaging revealed no movement among the enemy positions, just cooling metal and the slowly dissipating heat signatures of the recently dead. Reaper 27, Overlord, outstanding work. Can you assess the status of Phantom 6-1? Phoenix turned her attention back to the trapped convoy, focusing her sensors on the defensive circle of vehicles in the bottom of the wadi. What she saw made her throat constrict with emotions she'd learned to suppress during combat operations. Movement among the Humvees, Americans climbing out of cover, helping wounded comrades, beginning the grim process of triage that followed every firefight. Overlord, I have visual on multiple friendly personnel. Appears to be at least 10 individuals mobile and providing aid to others. Cannot assess total casualty count from current altitude, but significant friendly forces remain combat effective. She watched through her targeting pod as American soldiers moved with the practiced efficiency of professionals under fire. Medics rushed between casualties, their Red Cross armbands visible even from 8,000 feet. Others took up defensive positions, scanning the ridgelines for additional threats. The convoy might have been bloodied, but it wasn't broken. Reaper 27, medevac birds are inbound. ETA 22 minutes. Can you maintain overwatch until ground support arrives? Phoenix checked her fuel gauges and ammunition status. Enough gas for another 30 minutes on station, and still carrying a full load of Maverick missiles in case additional threats materialized. But more importantly, she could feel the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a familiar coat. Those Americans below had survived because she'd been in the right place with the right weapons at the right time. Overlord Reaper 27. I can maintain station for 30 minutes, ammunition remaining for additional targets if required. No additional hostile activity observed at this time. She established a lazy orbit over the wadi, her aircraft's shadow passing across the vehicles below like a protective wing. The radio chatter had picked up as other assets began converging on the area: helicopter gunships, ground support elements, medical teams equipped to handle mass casualties. The machinery of military medicine and logistics grinding into motion to save lives and extract lessons from another day's violence. But for now, in this moment suspended between combat and aftermath, Phoenix Okafor owned the sky over Phantom 6-1, and nothing moved in those mountains without her permission. Below, American soldiers continued the ancient work of binding wounds and counting the living, while above, their guardian angel circled with engines humming and weapons ready. 22 minutes stretched into an eternity of vigilant circles, Phoenix maintaining overwatch while the drama below played out in thermal imaging and radio chatter. She watched medevac helicopters appear as distant specks against the mountain peaks, growing larger as they approached the landing zone that Phantom 6-1 had carved from necessity and desperation. Reaper 27, Overlord. DUSDOFF 23 is inbound, requesting sitrep on landing zone security. Phoenix swept the surrounding area one more time, her sensors probing every shadow and crevice that might conceal additional threats. The ambush had been carefully planned and expertly executed until her arrival, and she'd learned not to assume that every enemy fighter had been accounted for. Mountains like these had a way of hiding secrets until it was too late to matter. Overlord Reaper 27. LZ appears secure, no hostile activity observed. Advise DUSDOFF to approach from the west to avoid overflying previous target areas. She watched the medical helicopters settle into the wadi like mechanical angels, their rotors churning dust into golden clouds that caught the afternoon sunlight. Ground crews rushed to meet them, carrying stretchers and the kind of urgency that marked the difference between life and death measured in minutes rather than hours. From her altitude, the wounded looked like broken dolls being carefully loaded into the helicopter's bellies. She tried not to think about the faces behind those thermal signatures, the families who would receive phone calls that started with phrases like "regret to inform" and ended with the kind of silence that stretched across generations. Reaper 27, this is DUSDOFF 23. Thanks for keeping the neighborhood quiet up there. We've got multiple urgent surgical ETAs to Kandahar in 47 minutes. The helicopter pilot's voice carried the controlled calm that came with years of flying into bad places to collect broken people. Phoenix had worked with DUSDOFF crews before. They were the kind of crazy that made her job look safe and reasonable by comparison, willing to land in active fire zones to extract casualties that ground medics couldn't reach. DUSDOFF 23, Reaper 27, Godspeed and safe flight. LZ remains secure for your departure. She watched the helicopters lift off in formation, their precious cargo secured and monitored by flight medics whose skills could mean the difference between heroes coming home and heroes coming home in boxes. The wadi fell quiet again, leaving only the vehicles of Phantom 6-1 and the scattered debris of the morning's violence. Reaper 27, Overlord. Ground support element is 15 minutes out. You're cleared to return to base when fuel becomes a factor. Phoenix checked her gauges again. 15 minutes of fuel remaining on station, enough to cover the arrival of ground forces, but not much more. She'd push the margins as far as professional judgment would allow, and soon she'd have to trust others to finish the job she'd started. Overlord Reaper 27 copies will remain on station until relieved by ground element. She established a final orbit over the battlefield, committing the scene to memory with the kind of detail that would populate her dreams for years to come. Victory always carried a price, and today's bill had been paid in American blood spilled on Afghan soil under an indifferent sky. But the living had been saved, and the dead would be honored, and Phoenix Akafar had proven once again that ugly airplanes flown by unorthodox pilots could change the course of history with nothing more than skill, courage, and enough ammunition to make the other side reconsider their life choices. The mountains below held their secrets a little less tightly now. The ground support convoy appeared as a dust cloud on the northern horizon, Bradley fighting vehicles and armored trucks crawling across the landscape like armored insects. Phoenix watched them approach through her targeting pod, noting the professional spacing and overwatch positions that marked experienced units operating in hostile territory. These weren't cherry replacements stumbling through their first deployment. These were veterans who'd learned to read the terrain like a survival manual written in blood and cordite. Overlord Reaper 27, ground support element in sight, approximately 8 minutes to link up with Phantom 6-1. She began climbing to a higher altitude, preparing for her departure while maintaining visual contact with both friendly elements. The tactical situation was stabilizing, transforming from emergency response to routine security operations that didn't require close air support. Her part in today's story was nearly finished, but she could already feel the weight of what would come next: debriefings, after-action reports, and the kind of institutional analysis that followed whenever unorthodox methods produced conventional success. Reaper 27, Overlord, outstanding performance today. RTB when ground element assumes responsibility for site security. Phoenix keyed her radio, choosing her words carefully. Overlord, Reaper 27, request permission to remain on station until positive confirmation that all friendly personnel are accounted for. Silence stretched across the radio frequency, the kind of pause that suggested conversations happening on channels she couldn't monitor. She could imagine Colonel Webb discussing her request with his staff, weighing operational necessity against fuel constraints and the dozen other factors that complicated military decision-making in combat zones. Reaper 27, approved. Maintain high station until ground commander confirms accountability of all personnel. She watched the ground convoy reach Phantom 6-1's position, armored vehicles forming a defensive perimeter, while dismounted infantry began the systematic process of securing the area. Combat engineers would sweep for improvised explosive devices. Intelligence specialists would collect evidence from the enemy positions, and medical personnel would conduct final triage on the wounded and the dead. Her radio crackled with the professional chatter of soldiers coordinating complex operations under dangerous conditions. Grid coordinates, ammunition counts, casualty reports delivered in the clip terminology that reduced human tragedy to manageable data points. She'd learned to speak that language fluently, but she'd never learned to ignore the human cost buried beneath the acronyms and numbers. Ground support element, this is Phantom 6-1 actual. We show 18 personnel accounted for, 5 urgent surgical, 2 routine medical, 11 combat effective. Request immediate site exploitation of enemy positions for intelligence gathering. 18 out of 23. Phoenix felt something cold settle in her stomach as she processed the mathematics of survival. 5 Americans wouldn't be going home to their families, wouldn't be calling their parents to complain about the food or the heat, or the boredom that characterized life between moments of absolute terror. Reaper 27 Overlord, ground commander reports site secure and all accounting complete. You are cleared to RTB. Well done today." She banked toward home, leaving the wadi and its ghosts behind as the sun continued its relentless march toward the western mountains. Her aircraft felt lighter now, magazines empty and missiles expended, but the weight of responsibility hadn't diminished with the consumption of ordnance. If anything, success carried its own burden. The knowledge that she'd made decisions that saved some lives while ending others, threading the needle between salvation and damnation, with nothing more than training, instinct, and enough firepower to reshape the landscape. The flight home would give her time to think about what had happened today and what it meant for tomorrow. The return flight to Bagram Airfield passed in the kind of silence that followed successful combat operations, engines humming their mechanical lullaby, while Phoenix processed the events of the afternoon through the lens of professional analysis. She'd expended 4 rockets and approximately 300 rounds of 30mm ammunition to neutralize 8 confirmed enemy positions, resulting in the preservation of 18 American lives at an acceptable cost in ordnance and fuel. The mathematics were clean, the tactical decisions sound, the execution flawless according to any reasonable standard of measurement. But mathematics didn't account for the faces she'd seen through her targeting pod, the Americans who'd climbed out of their vehicles to help wounded comrades while enemy rounds still cracked overhead. Numbers couldn't capture the moment when ordinary people became heroes simply by refusing to abandon each other, when abandonment would have been the logical choice. Bagram Tower, Reaper 27 inbound, requesting approach and landing. Reaper 27, Bagram Tower. You're cleared for straighten approach runway 03. Winds 040 at 12 knots. Weather is clear with visibility unlimited. She began her descent toward the sprawling complex of runways and buildings that represented the American presence in Afghanistan, a temporary foothold in an ancient land, maintained by logistics and determination in roughly equal measure. From altitude, the base looked like a small city carved from the desert, complete with roads and housing, and all the infrastructure necessary to project military power across a hostile continent. The landing was routine, her aircraft touching down with the controlled grace that came from thousands of hours of practice. But as she taxied toward the flight line, Phoenix could see the crowd gathering near the squadron operations building. Word traveled fast in small communities, and a forward operating base was nothing if not a small community where everyone's business became everyone else's concern within minutes of occurrence. Ground crew marshaled her aircraft into its parking spot with the efficient choreography that characterized military aviation. Engines spooling down, systems shutting off one by one, the transforming from flying weapon back into collection of metal and composite materials that required maintenance, fuel, and ammunition to remain relevant. Phoenix climbed down from the cockpit, her legs unsteady after hours in the ejection seat. The Afghan sun felt different on the ground, more immediate, more personal than it had from 8,000 feet. She could smell dust and jet fuel, and the peculiar mixture of diesel exhaust and human ambition that marked every American military installation she'd ever visited. Colonel Webb was waiting for her at the bottom of the crew ladder, his expression unreadable in the way that senior officers cultivated when they needed to discuss things that couldn't be reduced to simple praise or blame. Behind him stood the intelligence officer, the operations officer, and several other personnel whose presence suggested that her afternoon's work would require extensive documentation and analysis. "Captain Akaffer," Webb said formally, but she caught something else in his voice, a note of respect that hadn't been there during their earlier radio conversations. "Outstanding work today. 18 American service members owe their lives to your actions." Phoenix removed her helmet, feeling the weight of the day settling into her bones like accumulated fatigue. "Thank you, sir. Just doing the job." But they both knew it had been more than just a job, more than routine close air support in a war that had been routine for far too long. Today had been the kind of day that defined careers and lives, the kind of day that separated competent pilots from legendary ones. The debriefing would come later, along with the paperwork and the official recognition and all the other institutional responses to exceptional performance under fire. For now, there was only the satisfaction of knowing that she'd been tested by combat and found worthy of the trust placed in her by the Americans who called for help when help seemed impossible. The debrief room smelled of stale coffee and the peculiar mixture of stress and exhaustion that characterized military planning facilities in combat zones. Phoenix sat across from Colonel Webb, the intelligence officer, and a captain she didn't recognize who'd introduced himself as the liaison from Phantom 61's parent unit. Between them lay her mission recorder data, gun camera footage, and the kind of detailed timeline that would eventually become part of the official record. "Let's start with your initial approach to the target area," Webb said, his pen poised over a legal pad covered with handwritten notes. "What were your first impressions of the tactical situation?" Phoenix closed her eyes, calling up the mental photographs she'd filed during those crucial minutes when assessment became action. The absence of radio contact was the primary indicator that Phantom 61 was in serious trouble. Combined with the intelligence reports of insurgent activity in the area, I assessed a high probability of enemy contact. She opened her eyes, focusing on Webb's face. "When I located the vehicles, the defensive positioning and lack of movement suggested they were pinned down by effective enemy fire from elevated positions. The ambush was professionally planned and executed, overlapping fields of fire, excellent cover and concealment, multiple escape routes for the attackers." The intelligence officer leaned forward. "Can you estimate the size and composition of the enemy force based on your observations?" "At least 8 fighting positions, probably 12 to 15 individuals total. Heavy weapons included at least 1 PKM machine gun, multiple AK series rifles, and what appeared to be RPG launchers based on the muzzle flash signatures. They knew their business. This wasn't a target of opportunity. It was a carefully planned operation designed to destroy an entire convoy." Webb made additional notes, his expression thoughtful. "Your decision to engage at danger close range. Walk me through that analysis." This was the question Phoenix had been expecting, the one that would determine whether her actions were viewed as heroic or reckless by the people who wrote efficiency reports and made promotion decisions. The difference between calculated risk and dangerous improvisation often depended on outcomes that were beyond any pilot's control. "Sir, the tactical situation required immediate intervention. Ground support was 37 minutes away, medevac assets couldn't operate in a hot LZ, and thermal imaging indicated wounded personnel among the vehicles. Every minute of delay increased the probability of additional friendly casualties." She paused, choosing her words carefully. The enemy positions were approximately 75 meters from the nearest friendly vehicle. That's outside the minimum safe distance for high-explosive rockets against troops in the open, and well within acceptable parameters for precision engagement. My assessment was that the risk of friendly casualties from my ordnance was significantly lower than the certainty of.